at the time, my maybe silly hope is that all Western powers would unite. And what I said at the time was sort of like clean up the dirt of history. So in other words, are these people, places in the world.
Like Captain Planet or something?
Or Super Friends. Or,
Okay.
The Goldwaters is brought to you by Goldwater Dubé, shaping the history of Canadian family law since 1981.
The Goldwaters vous est présenté par Goldwater Dubé, modeler l'histoire du droit familial canadien depuis 1981.
Welcome back to the Goldwaters. I am your moderator, Dan Delmar, and I'm here with Daniel Goldwater. And this episode is kind of just a journey into your neoconservative mind in your 20s.
Yeah, it's like the magic school bus, like where they go through the ideological body in a little miniaturized bus. This is a bus episode, a magic school bus episode.
So we're taking the school bus inside of your mind in your 20s. What made you fall into the neoconservative crowd?
Yeah, no, I was just joking about that, of course. It was, put yourself in the spirit of the times. This was the great sort of shock of the spectacle of 9/11, and figures like Osama Bin Laden were public enemy number one. And this was all like really a sort of a heavy dose and rapid injection of a lot of these characters, this narrative, right, that was being presented by the jihadis that I was very much ignorant of. I mean, at that time, I was a young man. I was 17 when 9/11 happened, and up until then, I mean, I don't know, the most that I thought about, say, radical Islamic terrorism was that they happened to be, stock enemies in some Hollywood movies, like doing plane hijackings or something, like movie True Lies or something, Arnold Schwarzenegger beating them up. But it always felt something kind of distant and kitschy. Then all of a sudden you see fellow New Yorkers who kind of maybe look like me or identify with falling from towers on fire. That was not a movie. And so it was a scary time, and I think all sorts of people today, on wherever they are on the ideological spectrum, can really trace back a lot of the catalytic forces in their process to 9/11.
So Samantha's actually going to be interviewing you for this one and exploring some of what you were doing and thinking at the time. Did she have concerns throughout your 20s? Did she try to steer you more towards the progressive camp?
I think my sister's become more, say, I guess, progressive. I mean, I put scare quotes over that, guys. I don't know if you saw that, just to kind of take the stuffing out of her, not to admonish progressivism. In that, no, I think she's, I don't want to speak for her, but if you're asking my opinion, I mean, at the time she was also, a young woman, young person. I think also exploring politics, political ideology, sort of alongside with me. And she also was, it's important to mention, I was in a history degree, right? And so it's related to, say, political science. My sister was in psychology, so I also think that it was more of a more front and center. Like my daily digestion of a lot of these things was present. Whereas with my sister, I think it was a bit more distant, and I think she came into this with her more developed political views later on. But did she steer me? It took some time for her to start steering me. I felt at that time, one thing that I love about my sister is that it's funny, she got into the therapist. She's a therapist, and she's very good at listening to people. She's very patient. She's, I like to talk, she likes to listen. So it's a good symbiotic sort of relationship. So she would often listen to me and all my rantings and young sort of strident male bullshit at the time. And she, and then over time, she would just be like, don't be so strident, be more empathic. A bit of a stereotype of the civilizing influence that female forces have upon the male mind.
All right, let's jump right into it. The Goldwaters number 20, Dr. Sam unpacks Daniel's neoconservative past.
Why don't we start at the beginning? So you've spoken a lot, Daniel, over the years about how your political views have changed really quite dramatically. They used to be really quite right of center, and then things have changed over the years. And you've brought it up over previous episodes. You brought it up personally with me. I wanted to discuss a little bit today. I was just really curious about what that journey has been like for you. So let's start with this. How would you define yourself now?
This is going to sound obnoxious, but
I love obnoxious.
I know that's my trade, really. I go for post-libertarian.
Ooh, post-libertarian. That sounds fancy.
It is
okay,
fancy.
So define it. Define it for us.
Yeah, no, it's a conceit to try to avoid defining myself more narrowly. But so it's hard for me to find a label that really fits. I like to think of myself these days as more post-ideological. I always try to resist adhering to a structured ideology to influence all my political decisions, because I find that can lead me astray. I find that I become too ideological and I don't take the facts as they come. But that said, there's always a pattern. And I find that I'm more into socialism in terms of more as defined by Bernie Sanders. Now, it's not lock and step in every position, but I find myself much more open to notions of the welfare state and redistributive wealth principles, which is very hard to admit on the air because it's always been anathema to my political philosophy as an adult. So,
well, where did your political philosophy start? So you define yourself now. So we have you kind of at the well, not the end of your journey, but the current part
end of
your
my
journey.
life,
The end
really.
of your life.
Yes.
The end of your life at the ripe old age of 33. So you now define yourself as socialist, but you didn't used to. What did you used to define yourself as?
Well, there's actually a thread that is consistent from the beginning to today in terms of socialism, but I guess I'll unpack that organically as I go. Look, I was never political really until 9/11 is the truth, and it puts me in a certain time frame because like you said, I am 33. So
There's a lot of people have really spoken about that, how 9/11 really affected a big change in their philosophy and how they viewed the world. And so, yeah, go on. How did that affect you?
And for me, it landed at a time when I think most people start to become politically aware. I think it occurred maybe when I was about 17, and I was in CEGEP, and then I was going into Concordia University just shortly after. So it was a kind of odd intersection, because that's when I think most people are becoming aware of these things. And yeah, so prior to that, I was just not into politics or following these things. I was very much just like at a distance kind of viewer of these things. And I think part of that too is that, the 90s has been looked back upon as they call it, the vacation from history, right? In the 90s, because the Berlin Wall had fell. I was too young to really appreciate the significance of that when that occurred. I was probably about 5 or 6 years old when that happened.
Yeah. I think you're too concerned with Ninja Turtles at that point to be worried about the Berlin Wall.
That's a whole other subject.
And I digress.
Yes.
So, yes. So there was, yeah.
Yeah, so the 90s, I was apolitical. And in the 90s, in fact, if anything I was really invested in, I wouldn't give it that name. It's too adult a name to give it. But it was kind of like nihilistic. So if you think of the 90s, what was popular in my world and at that time, things like Beavis and Butthead. There was, the counterculture movement of alternative rock, like Nirvana and I guess Pearl Jam and all the people that came after. And so the 90s, if anything, was, I felt, defined by that sort of, that sort of shrug to things, being kind of the rise of postmodernism. But all those things, again, I was not conscious of all those monikers until 9/11 occurred. How 9/11 changed me was I became aware that there are what I perceive to be certain groups out there in the world who are devoted to true violent destruction of other peoples in very sort of medieval-like ways, right? It was nothing to me just perceiving it. It's not like you needed a political science degree to understand political realism and battling between great powers. It was to me, very primitive and very present, this notion of what I perceived as sort of medievalist Islamic fascists who just want to go around and bring people back to the Stone Age.
Now, I know it's interesting you say bring people back to the Stone Age. Did you feel that, when 9/11 occurred, I think a lot of people took it very personally, took it as, oh, what? There's people in the world that hate me, that hate us, that want me dead because of my views. Did you take it personally, or did you still see it as an other thing?
There was a personal angle in that. I mean, I've always defined as Jewish, so I knew that we were on the hit list. It was very much sort of wrapped up in perceptions, anti-Zionism. They were part of that cocktail. But to be honest, like the first ranking concern that I had was more I saw this as an assault on American culture, which I really embraced from very young. I was really into entertainment. I was a movie nerd. And I guess like a lot of Anglophones growing up in Montreal at that time, I always had the expectation that I would leave at least Montreal and probably Canada and set up shop in the States, probably in New York. That was, I think a lot of maybe Jewish Anglophones growing up here always had that sort of idea that maybe I'll move to New York one day and where all the...
Well, I remember you talking about that as a kid, you were actually surprised to find out that you weren't American. That there was some point where you had this, this great epiphany where you realized that you were actually Canadian and were, kind of devastated by that.
It was shocking. Yeah, it hit me. I remember when I said, Dad, do you think the Ninja Turtles live under that sewer grate? And he's like, son, I think they live like in New York, if I'm not wrong. And I'm like, well, don't we live in New York? And he's like, no, we live in Montreal, Canada. I'm like, is that a suburb of New York? He's like, maybe.
So when 9/11 happened, then you took it kind of personally and first order as, having this affinity with Americans and feeling kind of American, and it felt like an attack in that way. And sort of secondarily, this idea that, okay, well, they're also, Jews aren't their favorites. And so I have two strikes.
Yeah. So the Jew aspect was present. It was second ranking. I felt it as an assault on American culture I identified with and which I loved, but probably because I was an entertainment junkie, and entertainment like flows out of the United States. And I was still a social liberal. I grew up very, we were very open on, we were pro-gay, pro-minority rights. We were, standard liberals, right? In just in our basic reflexes.
So I guess you started off as kind of an unconscious liberal or an unintentional liberal. And then when 9/11 came along, then all of a sudden you felt this kind of threat that was going on. And then how did that start to shift your political views?
Well, it made me more militant because I felt when, witnessing the spectacle of 9/11 that this is maybe a real and present danger, that everything that is what I love about America, I know there's many Americas, like people talk about American culture. Again, to me, really the proxy was probably like New York culture or some such, being again like a Northeastern, North American English-speaking Jew. That was kind of my proxy for understanding American culture.
Yeah, we traveled a lot to New York.
We went there almost every year in the summer.
Yeah, easily twice a year.
It felt like a home. And so I felt as though it was like my home was under attack.
Okay.
And I felt as though what really concerned me then is when I started to have more of these sort of mature conversations with peers and also reading the news more and editorials, witnessing on the left what I perceived to be this sort of anti-imperialist accommodation of alternative views. So in other words, it would be like you'd have a lot of leftists coming out at that time being very sympathetic to say not essentially the explicit religious goals of radical Islam, but things would be couched in terms of, oh, this is what America deserves, because of years of imperialism, of white ethno-nationalism, and all the isms that you can throw at America.
And America's chickens have come to roost. That
Exactly.
somehow that this was a direct, logical, and reasonable consequence of
A comeuppance.
Yeah.
This was a narrative out there that I perceived on the left. I also perceived on the left a certain cultural relativism, which was en vogue, and I guess it always is in different ideological circles, that, well, we should not judge these maybe radically Islamic culture in general, Islam, say at large, because people have different modes of living. And who are we to be culturally arrogant and to say that, say, a woman that's wearing a full burqa is oppressed or is wrong-headed? That's not very enlightened of us to say that, and that we should give room to other ways of other social configurations, even if we find them anathema to our own values. That's part of what liberalism means. This was the argument being put out by certain people on the left, and I found that very frightening and confused. I said, well, at that point, like the center can't hold. Like if you're just going to look at the world and say, no matter what you perceive to be an injustice or philosophically wrong-headed, you just kind of throw up your hands and say, well, white guilt, and who are we to say? I found a recipe for inaction and for defeat in what I saw as a true global conflict that was brewing.
So some of the liberal ideals that you had before, even though you didn't identify that way, was just this a little bit more accepting of, a little bit more accepting, a little bit more relativistic of different groups until all of a sudden there's a real threat. And it's just like, wait a minute, there's other people in the world that want to kill people like me and that want to threaten these values. Well, wait, we can't just say all values are okay. There's something else going on here. And so you started to shift more militant. And so where did you start to identify from there?
Well, I should also mention that the context of Concordia University helped, I think, intensify the debate in my mind, because at that point in time, Concordia had a lot of press about its sort of confrontational politics on campus. There was a very activist left there. And also there was a large Arab population at Concordia, and there were many pro-Palestinian and sort of pro-Arab causes there.
And there was quite an alliance between the I found like the liberals and the kind of Arab right and Palestinian human rights groups that I experienced at Concordia as well. That it was just that the two groups seemed really very closely aligned.
Yeah, so witnessing on campus, I remember they had effigies to the martyrs on the mezzanine floor in the downtown campus.
Yeah, they had a mock cemetery. I was there for that. They had a mock cemetery, and they had big signs everywhere that said "Made in Israel," and sort of big, sort of rolled out papers with lists of the martyrs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and at that point, of course, with George Bush in office, was a bit of a caricature in many ways, sort of like the dumb American, right? Mm. And I felt as though you'd have a lot of. It's very popular to criticize him, make fun of him.
Yeah, there was a big caricature, I think, around that same time of Bush with, I think, swinging a cowboy hat with his pants undone, holding the Twin Towers.
Yeah, as his phallus, or his twin phalluses.
His twin phalluses.
Phalli.
Phalli. It was pretty.
Yeah, I found it frightening and offensive, and I thought to myself, to me, it just seems so simple. It's like, why are you trying to admonish the only hope that we have of counteracting this radical, I saw medievalist, really is how I saw it. There are these people that want to bring us into the Stone Age. It's very explicit. They're very clear about it. And they've had a very credible effort at trying to destroy modernity. It's like, this is beyond just, I think that there are some crackers in America who are wrong-headed, or, it's beyond just the standard sort of left-right debates we have within the West. This is like a complete destruction of that entire discourse. This is the destruction of modernity. And here you are trying to influence young minds. You're trying to say that, no, actually, you should not trust the only people here that have a chance of undoing this threat, and they're actually all clowns, and we should be sympathetic to the alternative view. I found the left had lost its mind. I'm like, this is what the left is proposing. This is an unworkable philosophy. And another thing too, when it comes to white guilt, which is a big topic, and that a lot of right wing people will say the left suffers from. I started to witness that. I was in history as well, right? So I was also at this point in my history degree, sort of consuming the backlog of the historical record and the debates surrounding it. And, my perception is that while you could look back on the 20th century and, the age of imperialism, white people did a lot of nasty things, no doubt.
Oh, yeah.
I also felt, on the one hand, I didn't have a dog in the fight in a certain way. I never felt white guilt because I was Jewish. I'm Jewish. I never fully identified with it. I always thought of it as, my people aren't responsible for that stuff. Like, we were not in command of great Western nations running amok and trying to build empires on the backs of vulnerable people. So I don't feel any guilt. Like, that's not me. It was somebody else that did that. That's how I perceived it. And if anything, my tribe, my people were kind of on the bad receiving end of a lot of these shenanigans. And so I didn't identify with it. So when I would speak to some people, sort of other white liberals, and they would talk about the history of white oppression, I would say, sure, some of those things happen and we should call them out. But overall, this is a force for good, for all the fact that there might have been horrible acts of oppression by Native peoples out there in the world. there was still something a bit benign about what was going on. They were just trying to build businesses, really. Now, I'm not trying to, again, throw it under the rug, sort of like, horrible humanitarian crisis that occurred in, say, in West Africa and other parts of the world. But we should distinguish these people, say, from like Nazis. Like sometimes I find some people like collapse these things together. They'll say, well, the European powers came into Africa and came into Asia and carved it up with some sort of bloodlust. And I'm like, yeah, we could talk about the errors committed there and the cultural arrogance, but sometimes people will kind of try to lump it together as they're all just war criminals. Like they're no different than like Hitler and the Nazis. I'm like, no.
And so you saw an important nuance between sort of white or Europeans who oppressed and really, committed genocide often against other people out of just, as a collateral damage to forming a business versus ones that really had an ideology where it was, ils font exprès, like they were really like, no, you guys are terrible. We're going to try to kill you.
If you look at liberal, democratic, Anglo and European forces and the ideologies that supported them, even in the early 20th century, my feeling is that part of the philosophy was this promise that all people should have democratic rights. And it just means they were not fulfilling their promise. The promise that they'd promised to their own people, and it was always a period of constant extension. All right, let's extend the franchise to women. Let's extend it to blacks, to Jews. Let's extend it to other people. And even when they started engaging in these imperial crusades, that was always still the bubbling thing from underneath. It's like, well, we should be giving these people some sort of rights. These were debates within their own countries, and then they were saying that, well, they might not be our own people. Look, if you look, we're in Quebec. If you think about North America and Quebec, that was also the birth of our own countries, is that we were... the argument was that there was, well, in the States at least, there was taxation without representation. So these imperial forces in, say, Great Britain, and they were saying, all right, let's take tax money from these colonies, but we're not going to give you true parliamentary representation. There was a rebellion and in the United States and say, no, like this is the promise of liberal democracy. We have to be able to vote and be enfranchised. You're not living up to your original promise, say, British overlords, and that's why we're protesting. And I think that if you look in most colonial examples, that's kind of the context, is that the home country, the imperial power, has this system, and it's just not extending it as it should.
So let me see if I got this. So pre 9/11, you're sort of apolitical, you sort of default liberal, but without a label. And then come 9/11, you feel this big threat coming on against modernity and sort of secondarily against Jews. And you felt like you identified with both sort of groups. And so it just, it was really quite a visceral response. And then in the context of being at, and then hearing the way that some liberals, and particularly at Concordia, your experience was that they were really defending kind of these attacks, these 9/11 attacks, and defending, the Taliban and these other groups, and saying, well, we kind of had it coming, and it was sort of our fault because we suck. And you felt, well, no, we don't suck. We or white people, I don't really fit into this group anyway. We're actually doing their best to bring modernity, however flawed the execution was. And so that brings you to conservatism,
and we should aid in the proper execution thereof. That if anything, we should be more engaged with trying to encourage American power, Western powers, to execute their power in responsible and effective ways.
So you saw 9/11 almost as a call to expand the West's influence even more.
Yes, in fact, I felt as though, my vision. This is also what didn't happen, end up happening, but at the time, my maybe silly hope is that all Western powers would unite, and what I said at the time was sort of like clean up the dirt of history. So in other words, are these people, places in the world,
like Captain Planet or something?
Or Super Friends, or,
okay.
And they would all band together, and they would look at the world, and they would say, all right, there's huge swaths of this planet that are what I say like mired in history, that they're stuck in some retrograde space. Like I never saw, say, sort of, maybe talk about medievalist sort of philosophies by radical Islam in certain parts of the Middle East. I just thought, I'm like, yeah, the West was there at one point. Like, that's just part of how history works. We all started as hunter-gatherers. We become sedentary. We discover farming. We discover then these, like, uniting religious ideas to try to organize our people. And then we exit religion with sort of colorblind democratic principles. That's how history works. Like, just,
so you saw it very sequential, sort of in stages and sequential. And at the time, you thought, well, we just need to go civilize them.
Yes.
Okay.
Which altogether, I mean, when you say that, yes, it kind of it brings out this idea of the cultural arrogance, or that's a dangerous idea to have. And I recognize it's dangerous, but let's talk about it. Let's talk about how it's to be done.
But that's what you were believing at the time, and so then you started to.
And let me be clear,
Yeah.
civilized. It wasn't like let's kill them all and let God sort them out. That's not what I mean by civilized. And I thought my vision was
Let's dress them all in J. Crew and show them, some MTV or something, and
pretty
all will
much,
be well.
yeah, defang them with the luxuries of modernity and all like the silly consumerist nonsense that we get into, which is benign and just fun and keeps us entertained. My vision at the time was that all the great powers should unite and sort of nurse the places of the world that are in need over a number of generations until they catch up with the West. That was my vision at the time. That's what I saw, perhaps foolishly looking back, as what Iraq was going to be about. They were going to go into these places that have vicious dictators and are oppressing their people and have no opportunity, and go over there for, again, it would take a couple generations of occupation, but benevolent occupation was
Wait.
well, for true. If you look at even look at the history of imperialism, I mean, I even think if you were to speak to, Indian nationalists, for all that they can have all sorts of misgivings about the British Raj and how it affected them and the lack of rights that they had, simultaneously their own leaders would acknowledge that the accelerant that it was for their own society in terms of ushering them into modernity, in terms of helping uplift the subcontinent. There's parallel observations that can coexist.
Okay, so this is something that you were really thinking at the time, that like you were hoping that 9/11 would sort
Super
of
friends.
Super friends, yeah, join together, super friends, and like kind of go to these backwards, like quote backwards parts of the world and
Kill all
stick
the bad
around-
guys. Yeah.
kill the bad guys,
Kill the Hitlers.
Yeah, stick around for a while, show how awesome USA, AOK, hegemonic power, come on, buy in, and then they'd say, all right, we got this, modernity, and everyone would live happily ever after.
Yeah,
Kind of.
It's easy to admonish or criticize. It can sound, you make it sound like a caricature. But ultimately, if you think about, global economic capitalism and people who are free trade people, and that's part of the sympathetic notion behind this, is you want global capital. You want capital to circulate around the world so that everyone has access to it. So you could talk about it. You could sort of summarize it as, oh yeah, American hegemony and MTV. Oh boy, and that's you being satirical. But the reality is, having
That it does have an influence.
yeah, having opportunity and capital circulate around the planet for people who hardly have access to like drinking water or can hardly get to a voting booth. I mean, these are
can really boost people's standard of living and can
Right.
really affect political change. Now, when you were having this type of shift or kind of awakening, were you starting to, because for some people, Ayn Rand and stuff has really been a big influence in terms of shifting to conservatism and a very, individualistic philosophy and capitalist philosophy. Were you starting to get into those readings at the time?
Yeah, I was. In that, again, in my history degree, I really focused more on modern history. I was big into sort of post-revolution periods, so anything from like the 1800s to today, and so the 20th century and age of imperialism was really a close object of study. So anti-communism was something that I studied and researched, and sort of Ayn Rand is a key figure of that in the American intellectual context. Her being having been a young girl in the Soviet Union and then came to America and wrote all these, of course, very powerful books admonishing what she perceived as the corrupt ideology of communism and socialism and the marvels of objectivism, what she called it, but of hyper-capitalism. Essentially, every man should be free to pursue property to the fullest degree, and that's what makes for a good society. And that any opposite view that tries to hinder that is sort of leading down some evil path, in fact. So she made it much more stark and much more, Manichean, kind of black and white. It was a very intense narrative that she presented that really touched a lot of right-wing people in the States. She was a huge intellectual influence in the United States, though not.
Yeah, like for U.S. Speaker Paul Ryan, she was a really big influence for a lot of people there. Was she a big influence on you as well, or was she more kind of peripheral in terms of your evolution?
She was an influence in that, for me, what I took from her was that there was this. That maybe she's onto something. That to say that perhaps sort of this sort of radical libertarian idea that every single dollar that the government raises, takes from you, essentially is some sort of theft that's being redistributed to other people, and perhaps unfairly. Perhaps that the people who actually create wealth are the people who are the true leaders of society, and that people
That they merit it.
well, that they merit it, and that government also is just going to mismanage it. That essentially to be generally suspicious of government, that all governments, whether liberal or communist or fascist or whatever, seek their own perpetuity and their own try to justify their own existence, and that it doesn't respond to the same forces as capitalism. Capitalism is much more immediate in its consequences. If you don't sell a good product or you have a bad idea, you will crash and burn and go bankrupt quickly. The way that governments work is that you have like these 4 or 8 year certain periods where everyone gets together, and we know that that's not everyone. It's anyone who has the inclination or the access to these things who will come together and vote, and that there's a lot of cronyism, and that government in general should always be an object of suspicion. I think to this day, for any person on right or left, I think that's always a good way to look at it, and that perhaps she was onto something, that the true sort of utopic vision, say, of Marxists, which might have been some sort of socialism at the end of it, where everyone redistributes their wealth, is actually something opposite. That it's actually, no, it's where everyone, it's a sort of radical libertarian organization where everyone is able to pursue what they want without other people telling them, no, you have to support the other guy next to you. And she wasn't sort of, she's often misunderstood as being heartless, right? As saying, okay, well, you're not going to support your fellow man who's in need. Her view is that, of course you should, but no one should force you to do it. And that good morals are, in fact, inherent, and that people her vision, say, for the civil rights movement at the time was that the government shouldn't be forcing people to say you can't have black people in your establishment because that's a crime against liberty. You're forcing someone to do something, whereas a more noble way of doing it is that people will just agree over time to not restrict black people in their institutions. There's a people power, there's a market out there, and that good ideas rise to the top. And it's only when you interfere with these things that things kind of go haywire.
So I guess, so to put it sort of, I guess socially to capitalist-wise, you had this sort of shift around 9/11 and getting more into these readings, and with your experience at Concordia, or sort of as a backlash against what you saw was going on at Concordia, then you saw this as, okay, well, these traditional kind of Western or American ideals that we need to really spread them around, that they're the more advanced one, they're the ones who have risen to the top, and we need to spread them and expose them to other people, and that through this type of competition of ideas, then people will see that this sort of smaller government, more individualistic, capitalist type of view, and democracy, then people see that this is actually the best way.
Yeah, and there were also at the time, I mean, it was in the 90s particularly, was like kind of the rise of global free trade. This is, again, the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union. And there was a great enthusiasm, I think, on the left and right. I mean, depends how left you were, but for free trade, because the idea was that this was going to, again, raise all ships, and now people would have more access to opportunity and prosperity, and then all the other sort of social movements that kind of follow after people are economically enfranchised, right? Because once you're able, it's like, the higher Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Once your basic needs are cared for and you actually have some, you're able to take care of yourself, then you can afford sort of greater moral causes and more prosperity and enfranchisement for all.
So at this point, so you sort of explained like where this evolution came. This was sort of this political awakening for you that started with 9/11, and at this point you were, people ask you, you say, I am conservative, or I'm a libertarian.
No, I would never say conservative. I never identified as conservative because I associate conservatism with social conservatism. And I've never been a social conservative. In other words, people who are anti-gay marriage, who are
anti-abortion.
Or say, pro-life. And and people who I never associated with that strand of conservatism. I was also never a tough on crime guy, and so I could not make friends in those circles, which is what led me more to as a libertarian. I mean, that's what a libertarian, I guess, is defined, sort of like government, get out of my business. But what distinguished me, because a lot of libertarians are isolationists, foreign policy-wise, right? And you could see why, right? They're like, well, government, just leave everyone alone. And what distinguished me, and I guess that's what kind of made me a neocon, is that I also believed in a robust interventionist foreign policy. I also believe that we should be ready to act also before these things come to a head. If it's funny, think back to Iraq and everyone goes on, there were no weapons of mass destruction, what a lie, we were all cheated, and what a horrible project. My vision at the time was like, should we wait for that? Is that what we should do? I was okay with the notion of preemptive war, which I understand, doctrinarily speaking, is very troublesome. But I felt at the time that we have to act sooner before these things come to a head, and that's easy to call a spade a spade. There are evil forces on this planet. There are evil governments out there, and just look at it and act, please. And I think that's what defines neoconservatism as well. I think any neocon or people outside neoconservatism would say that, the axis of evil routine, right? That there is a notion of this ready to see sort of black and white is something that does define the neoconservative.
So, so you're talking a lot about 9/11, and that sort of led directly into interventions in Afghanistan, into Iraq. And you're just talking about that, at the time, going in preemptively seemed like it made sense to you, seemed like a logical thing. Now, is how things turned out in Iraq? Is that part of what shifted your view over time?
Yes. Simply put, I felt as though the West did not have the intestinal fortitude to do what I thought needed to be done. In other words, you have this war going on in two theaters, right, in Afghanistan and Iraq, and people are carrying on like it's just like going shopping. There's no draft, there's no war sacrifice, and there was this notion, and I really felt still at the time, I never bought into this sort of what Rumsfeld and Bush have been pilloried for, the notion that they would just show up and everyone would be like, oh, yay, democracy, yay, like Walmart's democracy, bring them. I never had that vision. I always saw it as this is going to be a long slog. This is going to be at least 2 generations. I always use my parallel example was Japan and Germany after the war. It took, these were countries essentially did not have a democratic tradition. Let's be clear. And it took about 2 generations of occupation for them to join the League of Modern Nations with actual liberal democratic ideas. And that's what I saw ahead of us. And so I saw that was not what was panning out. And I thought that was a shame. I was trying as hard as I could to always sort of bend over backwards to try to justify the neocon enthusiasm for what was going on in these theaters. But it was just day after day of being disillusioned. I just said, well, okay, if you look at the civilian deaths in Iraq, you're at like over 100,000. You've disbanded the army. It's, if anything, you've just kind of brought it back like a bit further back into the Stone Age. And you just feel like you're just going to now leave and have them like build it up themselves and put other sort of despots and local tribal interests into power.
So you saw it as going in and sort of destroying the infrastructure, killing a lot of people, and then just...
And trying to install, powers that would be Western friendly, but were still just corrupt and trying to represent local interests. I also was very much interested in the national rights of the Kurds, because I mean, not to get too much into the weeds of these things, but the Kurds are, I think, to this day, one of the largest stateless peoples like on the planet. I saw their plight similar, say, to the Jewish plight, like prior to Israel. And these were people who were very much allied, within American interests against the Ba'athist regime. And I just felt as though they needed to have maybe their own independent state. Maybe you need to carve up Iraq, right? But anyways, it just seemed to me like so in other words, kind of ironic, kind of goes full circle, because I guess it was sort of the old sins of imperialism are kind of repeating themselves in a way. It was kind of like, you go in there, you shake it up, you try to install friendly leaders, and you have no true long-term plan to actually enfranchise these people. And that there's strategic interests at play. There is oil there. You're going to have now a military base to project your military interventions in that region, and those are strategic goals, and I can acknowledge them. But if they're cut off from any other sort of
ideology building or sticking around or helping to build the society back up,
right?
Then
which is what I perceived in, say, the Japanese or German context, which is what I thought was something that was part of the goal. And I think reason strategically why it was more important in that context was because of the threat of global communism. It was more of a longer haul ideological battle in that context. There was this idea that, no, we are competing with this parallel idea that is competing for who's going to be the ideology for the modern world. And so it was like more of a long-term ideological battle. And I guess here it was just like, well, these are a bunch of medieval thugs. We're just going to go in, clean up, and leave. And I didn't see the same devotion to the project. It's actually kind of crazy, and people don't believe me, but I actually was interested in doing a tour of duty in Iraq. I'd done research on this when I was at Concordia, in fact, because they had a program for non-Americans who wanted to volunteer and to do a tour of duty in Iraq. And I believe after that, you'd be eligible for an accelerated American citizenship. And I'd seriously considered this probably for like a month. So I mean, how serious? It's not as if I actually made an application, but I was incensed to that point. Like it was something that I'd even considered at that time. I was so much, I don't like to say militant because second you identify yourself as militant, it kind of means that you're not taken seriously ideologically. But that was just an exhibit of how strongly I felt about this, and I really saw this as sort of a clash of civilizations, to use an expression that was, of course, very much en vogue on the right at that period, without going into the history of that expression. And so I really did feel it was that serious, and my hope was that, because a lot of people, the cultural relativists or people on the left would say, there's this coming monoculture, and people were anti-free trade at the same time. So this is what we're going to do. This is like kind of the caricature, like, all right, so you're going to have the America just like, move its weight around and turn us all into like consumerist zombies. And it's all going to be this like boring monoculture of people just, I guess taking selfies today, or some sort of like, brainless monoculture. And I always found that so offensive because I said my vision of modernity and modern liberal capitalism is that each individual is like a unique universe of ideas and philosophies. If anything, we've liberated people to be more independently thinking. That's no longer in a society where there is some sort of overwhelming ideology that threatens you, often with force, to enact certain ceremonies, certain ideas, right, that are totalitarian in essence. And that's a real monoculture. If you want to see real monoculture, go to dictatorial, totalitarian regimes. That's monoculture, where people are not allowed to express their own individual values. So I thought that the bridge to getting there is economic enfranchisement, and it might just be like, it'll be like Iraq in the future. I guess my vision after maybe a couple of generations, it'd be like America with Arabs, like whatever. It'll be a little different. They'll have different cuisine and whatever, but people will be able to have their own vision of the good life. And part of that I always felt, and this is the anti-religious element, I always felt that these were always incompatible forces, that for a society to become liberal, capitalist, democratic, and all the good stuff of the West, that you have to shed religion. That religion is an antagonistic force in this.
So you saw it as that the promise of, or what happened, that part of the promise of the reconstruct, the change that would happen after 9/11 would be that that there be sort of the West sort of uniting and spreading and sharing these types of ideals and sort of casting off the shackles of religion and dictatorial regimes and sort of fascist ideologies. And then through occupation over potentially generations, then, people would be kind of freed of this and be able to have more freedom to share their ideas, and some of the better ideas would rise to the top. And in the end, the experience in Iraq, or seeing how it ended up materializing, was just not.
No, it was it was a great disappointment. And
did you feel that people maintained the same fervor after 9/11? Because it seemed like after 9/11 that everyone was really quite united in this view. Well, to a certain extent, that okay, well, the Taliban are bad and they're hurting Western interests, and people were really trying to, there's the promise, at least, of people putting political differences aside and really, as you say, kind of joining together. And did you feel that actually ended up materializing?
Well, no, there was the coalition of the willing, right, that Bush et al. Had tried to arrange, and there were some people on that list, but many countries chose to abstain from joining that coalition, seen as a preemptive war. And I at that time had an axe to grind, in terms of France or the European powers, other powers that didn't join the coalition of the willing and preferred to kind of what I felt like is dither behind the UN and respect these silly notions of sovereignty to benefit dictators around the world. So yeah, I did see that there was a fracturing in the West, which really upset me. And I also felt that, I also want to be clear that I never saw, and this is actually kind of going back to your original point about when I defined as a socialist at the beginning of this, maybe today, and I tease at the idea that there is a socialist thread that unites me from even at the beginning of my political sort of ideological career or awakening to today, is that I still always saw things in terms of civilizational sequence, right? Hunter-gatherer, sedentary, religion, liberal capitalism, and then there's a fifth step. Now, the fifth step, just to say that, defines me almost as a Marxist. Just
Right.
the basic sort of review of Marxism was just that idea that history moves in these sort of predictable, almost mathematical sequences. And what Marx was proposing is that capitalism is the stage right before socialism, this ill-defined socialist utopia. And this fourth stage of capitalism, so it's not the end. It's not the end, right? And that capitalism has all sorts of contradictions and injustices that are going to eventually collapse under their own weight, and then socialist utopia ill-defined. That was always the ideological configuration of Marx, and that's what I think socialism, to me, represents. You kind of see it in that sequence. So I did feel, for example, that America today, or say Western liberal capitalist powers, that's not the end stage of civilization.
So even at that time, so even around 9/11, everything else, and you still, when you were really gung-ho capitalist and spreading sort of Western ideology, then you still had this thought that...
It was fetal, because this goes into the Randite sort of libertarian philosophy. I was still very much invested in this idea that all wealth is good and that redistributive wealth is an evil. I was over-invested in that view, but there were still seeds of that same idea that the American project, or the capitalist liberal liberal democratic project, can be perfected. It's not yet perfected.
So you saw this this was still a very fetal thing for you.
Yes.
And then seeing how things ended up, how, the West kind of ended up, instead of joining together, sort of fractured after 9/11, or, refractured, and that things didn't, Iraq ended up being kind of not the success that you were hoping it would be. That's probably the most generous way I can put it. That a lot of people died and infrastructure was destroyed.
Quagmire.
That this started to shift you over to really developing more the socialist thread. Now, was Bernie Sanders part of an influence in that too, or did this start before he came around?
It started before it came around, and I think, look, Bernie wouldn't exist on the national stage in the same way as he does in our current reality if were it not for the recession, right? I mean, the recession is really the real backdrop to these things, the 2008, 2009.
And was that a big influence for you as through this path?
I mean, not immediately when it landed did I see the implications, but yes, in its immediate aftermath, that's when my ideology did start to shift more towards socialism. So why? What I saw at that point were, I had sort of this maybe a bit of more of a blind enthusiasm about free trade and unhinged capitalism, and then I saw in the wake of the recession that these are not good stewards who are in charge. That these captains of capitalism and industry and banking, that there's crony capitalism out there that is destroying the social fabric. I saw an increasing chasm between the wealthy and the not so wealthy in Western context, right? That there was a widening chasm, a smaller middle class, and that sort of basic political analysis is never a good thing. So it's a harbinger for bad things to come. And I felt all these things were just in plain view. That once again in the aftermath of this of the recession, that you had all these funny money guys repackaging these toxic assets just to try to make a buck, and you get the insight into perverse CEO pay and how that it's completely unjustifiable. I mean, this is not my vision. Like, my vision of greed is good, and maybe Randite economic liberalism was never. So then, everyone we can have a few billionaires. Like, we can have, now we could have this cadre of oligarchs. Yay. Like, that was not what I had ever hoped for. My idea was just that everybody can just be untethered to pursue the good life and to have, and to make a good living.
And when you saw through the recession, and as this was starting to further kind of awaken you, did this become, did you start to see that sort of global capitalism and free trade and some of these ideas that you were really espousing before, that this was the inevitable consequence
Well, yeah, in a sense, yes. I started to
So
review.
at first you saw it as a way to be able to really move society, move the world, in fact, forward. And this is something that the West's responsibility is to unite and spread these values through. And then seeing, well, this didn't really turn out in Iraq. That's not how things happened. And the West is kind of fractured. And then you're seeing these sort of, oligarchs almost rising, these billionaires. So you were seeing this as the inevitable consequence.
Well, I think the great lesson of the Gulf War II and Afghanistan is that neoconservatism, neocons overestimated American strength. They overestimated America's ability to project its military strength around the world. There was maybe just a basic sort of operational limitation that was not truly considered. That was the lesson that I learned from that. So in terms of interventionist foreign policies, military intervention policies, I started to recognize that the American behemoth might not be as powerful as I thought in terms of doing these things.
And did you think that by America kind of flexing its muscle at that point, that would shift ideas?
Well, what I had hoped, shift ideas. I mean, the war for hearts and minds. Yeah, I had hoped that there would be
The war for hearts and minds with guns, that this would...
Well, guns. It's like saying, I know it's funny in political discussions. There's that reductio ad Hitlerium, observation that the more that you mention Hitler, the more the conversation's going off the rails.
Like guns with a little Hitler mustache on them.
Well, no. It's just I don't know. It's just say that to the seriously oppressed. When you're stuck in under this fiction of sovereignty, and there's some dictator that's throwing you into ghettos and is about to kill all the intellectuals and kill the gays and whatever people are on the list, and someone says oh no, we shouldn't have foreign powers come in here and save us because that would be arrogant. To me, it always seemed. I always thought that was a lack of empathy. I always thought to myself that there are. I watched, and maybe I regret it, a little traumatized, and when Saddam Hussein was on trial for war crimes, and the part of the evidence submitted to the court were all the Ba'athist torture videos, because they took videos of all the torture and all the executions. And I do. Look, it's gross and it's morbid, but that really affected me. Naturally, sitting down and watching all those videos and just and trying to put that in perspective. Try to say to yourself after that, oh no, should have just let them sort it out and try to negotiate. I'm no, these are acts of imaginable cruelty, and they were happening on a systemic sort of industrial level by corrupt forces.
So this became a really moral kind of humanitarian thing. America or the West needs to unite to be able to go essentially kill the bad guys.
And again, the bad guys are the bad guys. They're not brown people. They're not Muslim people. They're not Iraqis. The Iraqi people are the greatest victims of this oppression. It's it was never to me about I don't know, that these sort of a certain arrogance that all I don't know, these people are made for this type of arrangement. They like this medieval crap. I always thought that was the suggestion of non-interventionism and sort of cultural relativism. Is no, pat these cultures on the back. All these people who are being massacred or executed.
It's okay. They like it.
Yeah,
they like it.
This is what they chose. It's I don't think they chose that. I think a bunch of madmen bullies got into power and are imposing this on these people, and it's horrible. And we have to do something.
There's been a lot of discussion recently about how do we change people's minds. How do you shift people over? That there's this thought, this concern that, particularly in America, that things, and frankly, at certain places, through Europe as well, that there's been this shift kind of towards the right, towards this, traditional or kind of nativistic conservatism that's really deeply concerning. And how do we change people's minds? Because by calling them evil, people dig their heels in, et cetera. And you've had. Maybe not quite as dramatic a political shift over time, but you've shifted still quite dramatically over the past, let's say, decade in terms of how you view things. Do you have any insights into how to change people's minds?
What I've always hated. It's funny, for all that I've just spent all this time talking about the ins and outs of political ideologies and the historical record and things that I've reflected on, considered deeply. I've never been into political activism. I think I've suggested this before, and maybe it's something I should be ashamed of, but I've hardly ever voted. I've never joined a party. And I told you when I was younger, actually, I don't know if I mentioned it now, but I was more of an active member in the Fraser Institute. I wanted to get into the think tank world. I had an interview with the Rand Corporation. I wanted to move in those circles. And I have a deep suspicion of groupthink. I always found that whenever I went to these places and you're meeting these like-minded people, and I always was very suspicious of the flag waving that I would see. Like there are some conservative Canadian, say, intellectuals that I respect, maybe my cohort, my peer group, right, that might not be sort of public intellectuals per se, but that I've known, who I found certain ideological alliances with. And the fact that they all kind of stick together and they all kind of get overexcited about, I don't know, this Harper conservatives at the time and what they're doing and sort of the party politics of it all, it always kind of makes me retch. Like I always feel like we're all just standing in a room together and patting each other on the back and just kind of convinced of our own ideology. And we just kind of, so in other words, I mean, it's a roundabout way of getting to, I'm always much more interested in talking to people who think very differently than I do. Like I find that much more instructive and much more.
Well, it seemed to have been your big project after Trump was elected. You really started to purge yourself of liberal media and just start to read Breitbart and start to.
Yeah, I've completely changed my news diet. I read Breitbart. I read Daily Wire, which is. Ben Shapiro is like this huge rising star in the American conservative media circuit. I go to the pro-Trump Reddit forums.
Yeah. And it seemed like not even as a way to, not because you were buying into these ideas necessarily, but just to really try to understand where's this stuff coming from. And as you're seeing this, and you have this sort of visceral reaction towards sort of groupthink and towards some of these categories, and having delved into a lot of the really far right-wing media. And given your journey, have you found a way or thought of a way to be able to shift people over?
Well, I think it's acknowledging the grievances, starting out by, one thing that I find, with debates with mom and mom and I, we're both very anti-Trump, right? But what I find exhausting sometimes with my mom, we have these discussions is that I find she gets so wrapped up in the passion of it all that there's no maybe fair unpacking of the grievances that led to this, that led to Trump. Like, let's talk about the white working class in America in rural communities and how they've been completely hollowed out and disregarded and seen as a bunch of white privileged crackers that should not be part of our sensitive sort of liberal attention. And I say, let's pay attention to their grievances. They might have grievances. Maybe the solutions they're coming up with, I think, are ridiculous. But if you're just going to say, like, all the people who voted for Trump are redneck idiots, I think that's just not true. I just don't think it's true. And I think that you're just limiting your own intellect and political consideration if you're just going to see it that way. You're not going to go in and listen carefully to what these people are saying.
And it's interesting because it seems like it almost came full circle from 9/11, where it was this view that these people, the people that committed these crimes are evil, and there's no, the left is trying to understand their motives or say that the West had it coming, and that's just absolutely absurd, and these are just evil, sort of primitive people that are doing this. And then this sort of gradual shift to now where you're saying that even though you think that Trump's election was evil and he's doing these awful things, that, we can't call people evil, and that we have to really try to understand their grievances and where they're coming from and actively engage.
Well, because one thing that I maybe it's part of the news diet I've been on, but I did already have a sensitivity to it is, liberal elitism, right? That's something that they decry often, right? It's sort of like if you have a countervailing, counter-liberal thought, and God, heaven help you if you're a white male, someone will say like, oh, well, you have no right to say that. You benefit from white privilege, and you're a man, and so you can't really speak about grievance. And people, and on that side, they're saying, well, who the fuck are you? Like that is so arrogant and dismissive. I have grievances, and there's some sort of reverse racism at play too, but. So that's sort of like what I didn't like in party politics on the right or on the left. I can't stand being around a bunch of people who are smug. I can't stand being around people who are convinced of the of the rightness of their ideology, like, and that other people should be dismissed, like.
And so that's been kind of the shift, is that you were really quite adamant about your ideology before, and then over time sort of getting into the muddle and seeing how things ended up sort of panning out historically. It was just this, oh, wait, well, maybe things are more nuanced than that, and we should judge things individually and really try to engage with people.
What I've actually been developing recently and that I find is very helpful, I always try to think to myself, speak about politics or ideology as if the opposite side was listening. You know, I find that's very helpful. So don't speak presuming that the audience agrees with you, because that's just it's a useless endeavor, and it's not going to be convincing. You know, when you express things, picture like the ideological enemy is listening, and how the adversary or antagonist, let's say, and would the words that you're using be respectful and measured enough to have them listen?
Well, that's really interesting. Well, thank you, Daniel. I appreciate you sharing kind of this this journey that you've been through, and it seems to have come kind of, sort of done this real shift towards, all right, well, if we really want to change people's minds, if we want to better the world, however that is, then we really need to engage with people and engage with their grievances and try to understand their reasons and their motives, and have a little bit of flexibility in terms of how we move these things forward, and maybe seeing things categorically bad and good and evil and not evil. You think that there still are ways of being able to gauge, right and wrong, but that seeing things totally in those black and white terms is actually counterproductive.
Yeah, in any context, and on the right or on the left. And I think just to end off by sort of criticizing myself, because I did mention at the end of the day I've never really been engaged in party politics. I've rarely voted, and so there's something I think about the posture that I'm taking now with you on this subject. Sometimes I worry that it's also just a recipe for sort of armchair politics. It's a recipe for being a dilettante, because I don't feel, passionate enough to join a bunch of group of like-minded people. I always have this great suspicion that will lead me astray, and that and so I've always been kind of at arm's length from actual political activism or political engagement because of that. Like whenever I look at any political party, I don't know, I just try to see the warts and all, and maybe it's some sort of ideological purity in me. Maybe it's like a fault of mine. I'm just like, I don't want to be on a team because with a bunch of other people, again, convinced of the rightness of what they're going to propose to people, and just be in this echo chamber. And
so let me make a suggestion. Maybe we'll talk about this more after and end with this. But Goldwaters of the world, unite. we'll make our own party, our own mixed ideological party.
Right, because we would not be given to any subjectivity there.
No, obviously not. Obviously not. We're we got it all figured out.
But yeah, I speak, particularly the Goldwater clan and ideology, and you tried to pull me into the Jewish identity politics of this all, even though I had mentioned that I'm suspicious of identity politics. I think it's always very important to be the intellectual irritant, to be sort of being like a provocateur or being contrarian, is to always try to remind yourself that there is that the way that you're seeing things might be wrong. Like, I'm always suspicious of, even like I identify as a Zionist, but my reasons for being a Zionist are completely secular-minded. Like, I'm not religious in any way. I'm atheist, essentially. And for me, it's much more about seeing Jews, or at least Israel, and hoping for it, that it stays part of Western tradition, Western culture, sort of a larger ideological alliance, and not to get into sort of tribal inclinations or impulses, because it's going to disintegrate us, and that's, I think, what I'm seeing right now around the world.
Well, thanks for sharing, Daniel. Something that I've really wanted to unpack with you over time, and just really see, particularly given a lot of the recent discussions about how to sort of shift people and change their minds, and seeing a lot of really extreme political polarization. So I really appreciate you sharing your journey.
Sure, yeah, it was okay. It didn't hurt. I can still sit. So it was good to unpack it, and it helped me define where I've come to.
So, Daniel, how was that? We unpacked a lot of your 20s today.
Yeah, it burns in all the wrong places. I feel weird. I feel like my guts have been poured on the table and all my tubes are inside out.
Do you feel like you made a mistake?
Like in having the podcast, or like
No, in delving into that neoconservative world.
no. I think that actually looking back on it, I'm actually surprised about how more confident I am about my intellectual history. In that, putting it all together, I don't know, I was open to change. I had ideas. There was an organic process of give and take, and I'm not just some forever flag-waving ideological hack. So I'm sort of, I don't know, unapologetically happy about that.
But in your 30s now, have you noticed yourself shifting politically as a result of becoming older and wiser? Do you feel calmer about things?
Yeah, less testosterone. So I'm less, less intense about these debates, less ideological. I have less to prove. I'm older. I'm more spent. The meat is more marbled. And it makes me think of this quote by Vladimir Lenin, and I'm paraphrasing, where he had said something to the effect that I can't stand looking at the faces of young children because it distracts me from all my ideological enemies that I want to punch in the face.
Lastly, for those who might be questioning their ideology, regardless of what that is, in your case it's neoconservatism, but could be anything, what would you say to people who just are afraid to make that jump, to sort of change their mind a little bit and maybe explore the possibility that, well, maybe I wasn't so right about this thing?
Essentially, if your people are curious about these things, I think we're living in the internet, bro. We're living in a age of overabundance of information. Just Google these things. Start with the Wikipedia entry. No one's going to know. You're just going to sit there and read it and get sort of the background and get some of the jargon and terminologies out. I mean, quite frankly, you could fake yourself in some like highfalutin intellectual salon by just having read the Wikipedia entry on liberalism or something before you showed up, and people will think you're some great man of letters. So, I mean, funny about that. But yeah, I don't know. I would just say for people who are ideologically curious about flirting with the other side or just starting to flirt, just go on Wikipedia, go where people scream the loudest about these things on, Reddit or other forums, and listen and listen and listen until you feel like you have something really confident to say or not so confident to say. And find people who aren't blowhards so you feel comfortable enough expressing these things,
What's your further reading suggestion for this time?
There was an essay that I read as a young man when I was maybe 19, 20, and I was more, again, wrapped up in the neocon stuff, by Robert Nozick, who is an Ivy League philosopher. I think he's dead today. He wrote Politics of Utopia, I think. He's big in the political philosophy set, or he was big. He still is big. And he was kind of a libertarian anarchist, I believe. Anyways, but there's one essay that I read that people can Google and find. It's just an essay. It's called Why Intellectuals Oppose Capitalism. And it really had a major effect on me. And it influences me a bit to this day, like people who are who self-identify as sort of talky intellectuals, and how the capitalist system in some ways doesn't really favor their skills. They don't make as much money as sort of douchebag business bros, and that hostility and that anger never really goes away among the intellectual set. And the other further read I would have is Letters to a Young Contrarian from a Young Contrarian by Christopher Hitchens. A collection of his essays where, the theme being sort of his sort of contrarian impulses and all his ideologies that he's explored over his life. That also had a great influence on me. And again, the importance of being provocative, the importance of always questioning the prevailing ideology, and to not be afraid to explore ideologies, and and to do it with a little bit of charm and wit and live life like a work of art. These are fun things.
And that's it for the show today. Join us next time on The Goldwaters. You can listen to past episodes at thegoldwaters.ca. Join the conversation on Facebook or Twitter, #TheGoldwaters. And we're looking to hear from you as well. Drop us a line at talk@thegoldwaters.ca. I'm your moderator, Dan Delmar. Thanks again, Daniel.
Thanks, Dan.
This has been a production of TNKI Media. Good talk.